When it comes to storytelling, the Metroid series is one of the more interesting franchises in Nintendo's repertoire. Unlike their biggest franchises like Super Mario or Zelda, Metroid actually manages to adhere to a pretty straightforward and cohesive timeline, one that doesn't look like a UML model at least. And while it's certainly far from perfect, I think most fans of the series know of the various inconsistencies spawned by other M's crapshoot of the plot, it's still quite impressive how well all these games fit together for an almost 40-year-old franchise. Among the games, the Metroid Prime trilogy serves as the largest source of lore. The Scanvisor and the Prime games gave the writers virtually unlimited amount of freedom to add all sorts of background info and tidbits to enemies, locations, the local wildlife, and so on. It's also something that makes these games truly unique, even within the Metroid franchise itself, as the 2D games have no counterpart to this mechanic. It is truly a marvelous addition to the games and is part of the reason why the Prime games feel so immersive. Unfortunately though, when you add tons of lore to your game which takes place in a universe with established rules and concepts, you have to pay extra attention to how your story fits into the greater picture, or you might create contradictions that become very hard to fix, which is exactly what happened with Metroid Prime. If you aren't a hardcore fan of the original Metroid Prime game, you might not even know that parts of the game's background story surrounding the final boss, also called Metroid Prime, was completely rewritten between the original American release in November of 2002 and the European release 4 months later. Today I want to go through the original script of Metroid Prime, how Retro Studios changed it in subsequent releases, and what problems arose from this decision. At this point I should also mention that I got most of my info for this video from Wikitroid, the largest Metroid fan wiki. They have a wonderful summary of what I'm talking about in this video on Metroid Prime's page, so feel free to check that out if you want. Before I go more into detail about the lore of the original Metroid Prime, I'm first going to give you a rather basic plot synopsis of the entire game. The planet on which Prime takes place, Talon 4, used to be inhabited by the Chozo. One day the planet was struck by a meteor which contained highly radioactive phazon. The phazon quickly started spreading across the planet, killing the Chozo inhabitants and corrupting the local wildlife. When Samus arrives on the planet, the meteor is already inhabited by Metroid Prime, which also happens to be the source of the phazon itself. In the original version of the script, Metroid Prime was already in the meteor when it crashed into Talon 4, and despite its name, it isn't an actual Metroid. To prevent the spread of phazon, the Chozo erected a protective force field around the impact crater, which they refer to as the Cradle. Later on, the space pirates arrived on Talon 4 and eventually encountered Metroid Prime in a mining facility. They managed to contain and run tests on it which revealed its genetic similarities to Metroids, hence the name Metroid Prime. It eventually escaped from the space pirates' facilities, but not before absorbing a bunch of space pirate weapon gear into its body. When it returned to the caves of the impact crater, it started evolving armor plating which renders it invulnerable to most weapon types. At the same time, the space pirates recovered numerous Chozo artifacts. They wonder if these artifacts can be used to remove the cradle blocking the impact crater, but fail to make use of them. The inconsistencies in the original script are obvious. How can Metroid Prime freely get in and out of the impact crater if it's locked in by a force field? And even if Metroid Prime can somehow get through the barrier itself, how do the space pirates observe it within the impact crater? If they can overcome the cradle as well, then why are they even bothering with the artifacts? This version of the story also contradicts the core mission objective Samus has in Prime, collecting the 12 artifacts to gain access to the crater and face the source of the planet's corruption. There isn't much point to this objective if Metroid Prime can just exit the cradle at will, or the cradle can somehow be bypassed by other means. Because of these inconsistencies, Retro Studios completely retconned Metroid Prime's original story in the PAL release on the GameCube. In this version, the space pirates never encountered Metroid Prime in any way. Metroid Prime's origins and how it ended up in the impact crater are never explained either, leaving a noticeable gap in the game's lore. This version also removed the logbook entry which states that Metroid Prime is only genetically related to a Metroid, while the later released art booklet of the Prime trilogy went on to explicitly state that it is in fact an actual Metroid. Now while this fixed the inconsistencies of the original script, it also creates a new question, one which has the potential to create a million more problems if it isn't answered correctly. When and how did a Metroid get into the impact crater and evolve into Metroid Prime? You see, out of all the creatures in the franchise, the Metroids are the ones with by far the most background info, obviously, and their spread throughout the galaxy was relatively limited up to a certain point in time. So even a slight inconsistency can cause rather large contradictions with well-established Metroid lore. There are 3 possible answers to this question. A. The Metroid was already inside the meteor when it struck Talon 4. B. The Metroid entered the impact crater sometime between the meteor impact and the erection of the cradle. Or C. The Metroid entered the impact crater sometime after the cradle was put in place. Let's start with A. Metroid Prime 3 establishes that the meteor, or the Leviathan to be exact, originated from the planet Phase. This planet is situated around 361 light years away from the area occupied by the Galactic Federation, and was essentially undiscovered up until some point between the events of Prime 2 and 3, when Dark Samus brought a bunch of space pirates there. Needless to say, the chance that a Metroid was located on Phase before the meteor was even sent to Talon 4 is basically zero. Metroids were created by the Chozo on SR388 to combat the X-Parasites, and were exclusive to that planet up until some of them were stolen by the space pirates, who subsequently spread them throughout the galaxy. Prime's logbook entries state that the Leviathan hit Talon 4 at least 5 decades prior to Samus arriving on the planet, and therefore also several decades prior to the space pirates getting their hands on the Metroids, making option A impossible. Option B runs into the same problem. Now, Chozos did live on Talon 4, so there's a small possibility that one of them brought over a Metroid from SR388. But considering the game never makes any mentions of Metroids existing on the planet prior to the space pirates introducing them when they arrived decades after the Chozo's demise, it does seem far-fetched. Therefore, option B is off the table as well. This leaves us with option C. A Metroid entered the impact crater sometime after the cradle was put in place. Based on what we've established so far, we can narrow that time frame down to the time between the space pirates introducing the Metroids to Talon 4 and Samus arriving on the planet. This answers the question of when quite nicely, and it is easy to believe that a Metroid managed to escape space pirate containment, as they're shown to do that from time to time. But now we're left with answering how it entered an area which was completely sealed off by an impenetrable force field. Needless to say, there is no simple answer to this. In fact, for some time there was no answer to this conundrum at all, up until Metroid Prime came around. Prime 3 introduced two new Metroid variations, the Phazon Metroids and the Hopping Metroids. These are mutated forms of the Metroids found on Talon 4, and they just so happen to have some unique attributes which can explain how a Metroid might have entered the crater while also getting stuck in there. Phazon Metroids are mutated forms of Talon Metroids which were exposed to massive amounts of Phazon. After the mutation, they gain the ability to phase in and out of existence, allowing them to bypass physical objects and barriers. Hopper Metroids on the other hand cannot phase through objects, but they do have an exoskeleton which makes them tankier. In its logbook entry it is written that Hopping Metroids evolved from Phazon Metroids after radical mutation. Because of this, the general theory of how Metroid Prime entered the crater goes as follows. A Talon Metroid breached space pirate containment and started feeding on Phazon. This eventually resulted in it evolving into a Phazon Metroid, which allowed it to phase through physical objects. Hungry for even more Phazon, it sought to seek out the most Phazon-rich place on Talon 4, the Impact Crater. There it continued to quench its hunger until it eventually evolved into a Hopper Metroid, trapping itself in the crater in the process. This Metroid went on to eventually turn into the Metroid Prime you fight in the first game. As to why Metroid Prime can produce Phazon at will, usually the Leviathans sent by Phase have a so-called Phazon core, which is responsible for the production and the spread of the substance across the planet. The theory states that Metroid Prime also just ate this one, and assumed its role as the main producer of Phazon. Yeah, this part is a little shaky. And that's the biggest issue the theory has. It's far from decisive in a lot of areas. There's quite a few other questions which can only be vaguely answered. For one, the time frame between the Metroids being introduced to Talon 4 and Samus arriving is relatively short, meaning that for most of the existence of the Impact Crater, Metroid Prime wasn't actually in there. So what is the worm which the Chozo frequently mention in their lore? Obviously, Retro was referring to Metroid Prime when they initially wrote the script, but considering this is now impossible, you can make the argument that it was actually the Phazon core that the Chozo were referencing. You know, the one Metroid Prime ate for dinner. There's a bunch more of these inconsistencies listed on the METROID page which can kind of be resolved, but one in particular stands out. Even in the most recent version of the script, Metroid Prime makes use of various mechanical weapons during its fight. The original script explains these by Prime absorbing them while being held captive by the space pirates. Now, how exactly did it get a hold of them in the new version of the script? The wiki doesn't even try to give an answer for this conundrum, and understandably so. Now, if Metroid Prime 3 conveniently mentioned that Phazon Metroids have an affinity for gulping up man-made beam weapons, it would be a different story. But it doesn't. Because of this, we're left with a compelling theory which manages to solve the trilogy's biggest story-related problem at least partially. It's arguably the most logical explanation of Metroid Prime's origin, yet it still doesn't feel satisfactory, which just goes to show how unfortunate this error really is. Given that Metroid Prime Remastered did not alter the trilogy script in any way, it's safe to assume that Retro Studios doesn't intend to ever fix this blunder. Which is fine by me. A more detailed version of the script might create even more new issues while attempting to fix the old ones. It is interesting to me how a game that puts this much effort into its world building managed to create such a convoluted problem. But fortunately it doesn't affect Metroid Prime as a whole all that much. So just in case you've watched this entire video without ever having played Metroid Prime, please do yourself a favor and pick up the remastered version. It's truly worth it. I love this game to bits. Thanks for watching this video. Feel free to click on any of the links on screen, or the like button, or the subscribe button, or the exit tab button. You're a free person. See you later.